The transport shuttle docked at Station Velo 9 with a soft hiss of releasing pressure, and Kira Vasquez stepped onto the metal platform with her single bag over her shoulder, her dark eyes scanning the massive structure that would be her home for the next cycle. She was 17 years old, born on Neo Manila, a colony world where the gravity pulled hard and the storms never truly stopped. And she had learned to survive before she had learned to read. Now she stood in the gleaming halls of the Galactic Integration Academy, where young beings from 100 different species came to learn and grow and become the diplomats and scientists of tomorrow. She was the only human. The other students watched her pass with expressions she had learned to recognize, fear mixed with curiosity, mixed with something like disgust. Humans were new to the galactic stage, their species having made first contact only 12 years before, and the galaxy had already formed its opinions about them Deathworlders. They called her kind barbaric survivors from a planet of poison and predators and crushing gravity. Kira did not mind the stares, for she had grown up being underestimated, and she had learned that being underestimated was often an advantage. Her assigned quarters were small but clean, and she spent her first evening memorizing the layout of the station, walking every corridor and noting every exit, every alcove, every blind spot in the security cameras. It was habit, nothing more. On her third day, she noticed the silvery girl. The species was rare. Kira knew from her pre-arrival studies, a delicate people with skin like pale moonlight and wings of gossamer that grew from their backs in sweeping arcs of iridescent membrane. The silvery used their wings for emotional expression as much as for flight, and to see a silvery with wings fully spread was said to be one of the most beautiful sights in the known galaxy. But this girl kept her wings pressed flat against her spine, folded so tight they almost seemed to disappear, and she moved through the academy like a ghost, hugging the walls and flinching at every sudden sound. Her name was Velethani, though Kira would later learn she went simply by Vel, and she sat alone at the back of every class with her luminous eyes fixed on her desk and her shoulders hunched like she was trying to make herself invisible. Kira watched her for 3 days before she saw the scars. They were thin lines across the wing membranes, barely visible unless the light caught them just right. Dozens of them layered over each other in patterns that spoke of repeated damage and repeated healing. Kira felt something cold settle in her stomach. On the 5th day, she saw the Varuan. There were 4 of them, massive reptilian beings with armored scales and claws that clicked against the floor as they walked, and they moved through the academy like they owned it, which in a sense they did. Their leader was called Throck, the son of a senior diplomat in the Varuan collective, and the other students parted before him like water before a ship. Kira watched how the instructors looked away when Throck passed, how the security officers found somewhere else to be, how the entire academy seemed to hold its breath until he was gone. She watched, and she learned, and she waited. The moment came on her 7th day at the academy. She was crossing the courtyard near the atmospheric gardens, a vast dome filled with plants from dozens of worlds. When she heard voices from behind a maintenance structure, she recognized the deep rumble of Varuan speech, and beneath it, a softer sound that might have been pleading. Kira moved without thinking, years of instinct guiding her feet as she slipped into the shadows and found a vantage point where she could see without being seen. Throck had the silvery girl pressed against the wall, his pack forming a half-circle behind him, and his massive clawed hand was wrapped around one of her delicate wings. Vel was not struggling. Her eyes were closed, her body limp with resignation, and Kira realized with a sick twist in her gut that this was not the first time, that this was routine, that this had been happening for so long that Vel had simply stopped fighting. Throck said something in his own language that made his pack laugh, and then he squeezed. The sound that followed would stay with Kira for the rest of her life. It was like silk tearing, like glass cracking, like something beautiful being destroyed simply because it could be. And Vel made a single choked sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a sob. Then it was over. Throck released her and stepped back, examining the damage with what looked almost like satisfaction. And Vel slid down the wall to the ground with her shattered wing hanging limp at her side. The Varroan pack walked away laughing, and no one stopped them, and no one came to help the broken girl on the ground. Kira stayed in the shadows for a long time, her hands clenched so tight her nails drew blood from her palms. And she watched Vel slowly gather herself and limp away toward the medical bay with the practiced movements of someone who had made this journey many times before. That night, Kira did not sleep. She sat in her quarters with her personal terminal open, reading everything she could find about the Sylphery species, about the Varroan collective, about the political structures of the academy, and the diplomatic immunities that protected certain students from consequence. She learned that the Sylphery were a dying species, their homeworld lost to a stellar event 2 generations ago, their population scattered across the galaxy in small communities that had no political power and no voice in galactic affairs. She learned that Sylphery wings were not merely limbs, but extensions of their emotional and social selves. That to damage a Sylphery's wings was equivalent to cutting out a human's tongue and scarring their face and breaking their hands all at once. She learned that Vel's wings would heal slowly over the course of several days, which meant they could be broken again and again and again. And she learned that Throck's father was powerful enough that 3 formal complaints had already been filed and dismissed, that Vel's own brother had been expelled for academic dishonesty after their family had tried to seek justice. The system was broken. The system had always been broken, but Kira Vasquez had grown up on a world where the systems did not protect you, where survival was something you carved out with your own hands. And she had learned long ago that waiting for someone else to fix things was the same as waiting to die. She closed her terminal and stared at the wall. And somewhere deep in her chest, in that place where her ancestors had kept the fire that let them hunt mammoths and survive ice ages and claw their way to the stars, something began to burn. She did not know Vel. She did not owe Vel anything, but she had seen what she had seen, and she could not unsee it. And Kira Vasquez had never been very good at looking away tomorrow. She decided she would take the first step tomorrow. She would learn who Velathani really was, and then she would figure out how to make the breaking stop. Vel woke before the station's lights began their slow brightening to simulate morning, as she had done every day for the past 8 months. And for a moment she lay still in her small bed and listened to the hum of the air. Recyclers, her wings ached. They always ached now. A constant throb that had become so familiar she barely noticed it anymore. The way one might stop noticing the weight of chains after wearing them long enough. She rose slowly, her bare feet touching the cold floor, and she walked to the small mirror in her quarters and turned to look at her wings in the dim light. They had healed again overnight, as they always did, the gossamer membrane knitting itself back together with the stubborn biology of her species. And she could see the new scars layered over the old ones, like the rings of a tree that had survived too many harsh winters. The Sylphery healed it, was what her people did. What had allowed them to survive the loss of their world? What kept them alive when so many other species would have simply laid down and died? But sometimes, Vel thought, healing was not a gift. Sometimes it was a curse. She applied Medigel to the areas that still looked raw, moving with the practiced efficiency of long routine. And then she dressed in her academy uniform and gathered her study materials and prepared herself for another day. The walk to the academy took her through the residential sector and across 2 connector bridges, and she had long ago mapped out the routes that kept her away from the main corridors. The paths through maintenance tunnels and service areas, where she was least likely to encounter anyone. It did not matter, Throck always found her. She did not know how he knew where she would be. Whether he had access to the station's tracking systems or whether he simply had people watching for her. But every morning, without fail, he was there today. He was waiting at the junction near the hydroponics bay, his pack arranged behind him in their usual formation. And Vel felt her hearts. She had too. Like all Sylphery, begin to beat faster, even as she forced her feet to keep moving. Perhaps if she did not stop, if she simply walked past them quickly enough, a massive clawed hand closed around her arm and yanked her sideways into an alcove. And the familiar smell of Varroan musk filled her nostrils as Throck's snout came close to her face. "Good morning, little broken thing," he said, his voice a low rumble that she felt in her bones. "I was worried you might have found a new route, and I would miss our time together." His pack laughed, the same laugh she heard every day. And Vel did not respond, because she had learned that responding only made it worse. Speaking made it worse. Crying made it worse. Everything made it worse except silence and stillness. And waiting for it to be over, Throck spun her around and pressed her against the wall. And she felt his claws trace along the edge of her left wing with an almost gentle touch that made her skin crawl. They healed nicely, he observed. "Your species is remarkable, you know that? No matter how many times I break you, you always put yourself back together, like a toy that repairs itself for my amusement." He gripped the wing membrane and began to squeeze, slowly. And Vel closed her eyes and bit her tongue and focused on breathing. "My father says your kind are evolutionary dead ends," Throck continued, his voice conversational, almost friendly. "He says the galaxy is better off without species that cannot protect themselves, that nature should be allowed to take its course. I think he might be right, don't you?" The pressure increased, and Vel felt the familiar pain begin to build, the membrane stretching beyond what it could bear. And she made herself go somewhere else in her mind, to a memory of her homeworld that she had never actually seen, a planet of floating islands and eternal sunset that existed now only in stories and dreams. The first tear came, and she could not hold back a small gasp, and Throck made a sound of satisfaction. "There it is," he said. "I do enjoy that sound." He finished his work with a final sharp twist, and Vel felt her wing collapse, the membrane torn in 3 places, and she slid to the ground as he released her. "Same time tomorrow," Throck said. And then he and his pack walked away, and she was alone. She stayed on the floor for several minutes, breathing through the pain, waiting for the worst of it to pass before she attempted to stand. This was her life. Now, this was what every morning held, and every morning would hold, until she finished her studies, or Throck grew bored, or she simply stopped existing. And lately she had begun to think that the third option might come before the other two. She did not tell anyone anymore. Her family had tried to help, had filed complaints and demanded investigations. And all it achieved was her brother's expulsion and a warning from the Academy administration that continued disruptions would result in her own removal. The Sylphery had no power here. The Sylphery had no power anywhere. She made her way to the medical bay and received treatment from the automated systems, the same systems that never asked questions and never filed reports. And then she went to her first class and sat in her usual seat at the back and tried to focus on the lesson. That was when she noticed the human watching her. The girl had arrived recently. Vel knew, the only human at the academy, and the other students whispered about her in the corridors. Deathworlder, savage, dangerous, but the human was not looking at Vel with fear or disgust or the casual disinterest that most species showed her kind. She was looking at Vel with something that might have been recognition, and something that might have been anger, and something else that Vel could not quite identify after class. Vel fled to her usual hiding spot in the atmospheric gardens. a small alcove behind a cluster of ferns from some jungle world, where she could sit in the artificial sunlight and pretend she was somewhere else. She was not alone for long. The human appeared around the ferns, moving quietly despite her heavy build, and she looked at Vel for a long moment before sitting down on the ground a few feet away. Vel pressed herself against the wall, her damaged wing throbbing. Every instinct screaming at her to run. The human said nothing. She simply sat there, her dark eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance, her presence neither threatening nor comforting, but simply there, like a rock in a stream that the water had to flow around. After several minutes of silence, the human spoke. "I'm Kira," she said, her voice surprisingly soft. "I'm not going to hurt you. And I'm not going to ask you anything, and I'm not going to tell you everything will be okay, because I don't know if that's true." She paused, and Vel found herself holding her breath. "I'm just going to sit here for a while," Kira continued. "And tomorrow I'm going to sit here again, and the day after that. And you can talk to me or not talk to me, whatever you want. But I want you to know that you're not alone anymore, even if it doesn't feel that way." Vel did not know what to say. No one had ever spoken to her like this, without demands or expectations or pity, and she felt something strange and painful stir in her chest. Something she had thought was dead. She did not speak, but she did not run, and when Kira returned the next day, and the day after that, Vel found herself beginning to believe, for the first time in months, that perhaps there was still something in the universe worth hoping for. Every day after classes, she found Vel in the atmospheric gardens and sat with her in the quiet alcove behind the ferns. And slowly, like ice melting in sunlight, Vel began to speak. It started with small things, comments about the lessons, observations about other students, questions about Earth and what it was like to grow up on a death world. Kira answered honestly, telling Vel about the storms on Neo Manila that could rip the roof off a Habdome, about the predators that hunted in the jungle beyond the colony walls, about the way humans had learned to survive by being stubborn and violent and too stupid to know when they should give up. Vel listened with wide eyes, her bioluminescence flickering with colors that Kira was learning to read, and sometimes she even laughed, a soft sound like wind chimes that made Kira's chest feel strange. But there were things Vel did not talk about. She did not talk about Throck, even though Kira saw the fresh damage every morning, the way Vel moved carefully to protect her healing wings, the way her glow dimmed a little more each day. She did not talk about her family, except once, briefly, when she mentioned a brother who had been sent away, and a mother who cried every time they spoke on the communication channels. She did not talk about the future, because Kira had begun to understand that Vel did not believe she had one. It was on the 15th day that something changed. Vel arrived at their usual spot, looking worse than Kira had ever seen her. Her wings so badly damaged that one of them hung at an angle that suggested the structural bones had been broken, not just the membrane. She sat down heavily and stared at the floor, and her glow was so dim she almost looked gray. "He said something new today," Vel whispered, her voice barely audible. "He said he was getting bored with just the wings, and that he wanted to see what else would heal." Kira felt her hands curl into fists. "He touched my face," Vel continued. "He put his claw right here," she gestured to her cheek, "and he told me to think about that until tomorrow." She looked up at Kira, and her eyes were dry, beyond tears, empty in a way that made Kira think of veterans she had known on Neo Manila, soldiers who had seen too much and felt too much and had simply shut down inside. "I stopped eating 3 days ago," Vel said. "I do not see the point anymore, and I thought you should know because you have been kind to me, and I did not want you to wonder why I stopped coming." The words hung in the air between them. Kira sat very still, feeling something shift inside her, a decision being made in some deep part of her mind that she had not consciously reached yet. "Vel," she said, and her voice came out rough. "Can I ask you something?" Vel nodded. Do you want them to stop? The question seemed to confuse Vel, her brow furrowing as she processed the words. I do not understand, she said. What I want does not matter. It has never mattered. Wanting things does not make them happen. That's not what I asked, Kira said. Leaning forward, I asked if you want them to stop. If you could choose anything in the universe right now, would you choose for Throck to never touch you again? Vel opened her mouth, then closed it, and Kira saw something flicker in her eyes. A tiny spark in all that emptiness. Yes, Vel whispered. And it sounded like the word cost her something to say. Yes, I want them to stop. I want to walk through the corridors without being afraid. I want to wake up in the morning and not know exactly how much pain is waiting for me. I want. She stopped, her voice breaking, and tears finally came spilling down her pale cheeks in silver trails. I want to live, she said. I did not know I still wanted that, but I do. I want to live. Kira reached out and took Vel's hand. The Sylphery's fingers small and cool against her own. Then they're going to stop. Kira said Vel looked at her with confusion and disbelief and a fragile hope that she was clearly afraid to feel. You cannot fight them. She said, they are Varroan. They are bigger than you, stronger than you, and their father is one of the most powerful diplomats in this sector. No one can touch them. I'm not no one, Kira said. I'm a Deathworlder, remember? She squeezed Vel's hand once and then released it, standing up with a smooth motion that made her look, for a moment, like something dangerous. I need you to trust me, Kira said. I need you to eat dinner tonight and breakfast tomorrow. And I need you to stay alive long enough for me to fix this. How? Vel asked. Kira smiled, and there was nothing soft in it. I'm going to make it so Throck can never hurt anyone again, she said. I'm going to teach him what happens when you make an enemy of a human. She turned and walked away, leaving Vel alone in the gardens. That night, Kira sat in her quarters and pulled up everything she could find on Varroan anatomy. Their scales looked tough, but she found the weak points, the joints where the armor was thinner, the nerve clusters that could be targeted for maximum pain, the way their arms were structured, and where they could be broken most efficiently. She studied their fighting style, which was built around their size and strength advantage, and she noted how they assumed any smaller opponent would try to create distance. She would not create distance. She would get close, inside their reach, where their size became a disadvantage. She practiced in her quarters, moving through forms she had learned on Neo Manila, where self-defense was taught in schools, because the colony could not afford to lose anyone to something as simple as violence. She thought about her father, who had died fighting off a pack of tunnel wolves to give the rest of his work crew time to reach safety. She thought about her mother, who had raised 4 children alone in a world that seemed determined to kill them. She thought about what it meant to be human, to carry inside you the legacy of a species that had faced extinction dozens of times and had always refused to die. And she thought about Vel, alone and afraid and ready to give up. And she felt the fire in her chest burn hotter tomorrow. She decided tomorrow she would walk Vel to the academy through the main corridors. Tomorrow she would let Throck find them, and tomorrow the galaxy would learn that there were some prey that should never be hunted, because sometimes the prey hunted back. Vel stood at the entrance to the main corridor, her heart's pounding so hard she could feel them in her throat. And she looked at Kira like the human had lost her mind. This is insane, Vel said. We cannot walk this way. This is where everyone walks. This is where he will find us. I know, Kira said. And her voice was calm in a way that made Vel feel both terrified and strangely safe. That's the point. She held out her hand, and after a moment of hesitation, Vel took it. They walked together into the flow of students heading toward the academy. And Vel felt every eye turn toward them, felt the whispers start, felt the familiar cold fear spreading through her body. But Kira's hand was warm and steady, and her steps never faltered, and Vel found herself matching that pace. Walking taller than she had in months, they made it almost to the central junction before Throck appeared. He stepped out of a sidecar with his pack behind him, and the other students scattered like fish fleeing a predator. And suddenly there was a circle of empty space with Throck on one side and Kira and Vel on the other. "Well," Throck said, his voice carrying across the corridor, "the little broken thing found a friend." "How touching." His pack laughed, and he took a step forward, his claws clicking against the floor. "I have heard about you, human," he continued, looking at Kira with an expression that mixed curiosity with contempt. "The Death Worlder, yes? The savage from the poison planet? I did not think your kind would be stupid enough to get involved in things that do not concern you." "You're wrong," Kira said, and she released Vel's hand and stepped forward, placing herself between the Sylphery and the Voruan. "This concerns me." Throck tilted his head, genuinely puzzled. "Why?" he asked. "She is nothing. Her species is nothing. They are weak and dying, and they contribute nothing to the galaxy. What possible value could she have to you?" "She's my friend," Kira said simply for a moment. Throck just stared at her, and then he laughed, a deep booming sound that echoed off the walls. "Your friend," he repeated. "A human befriends a Sylphery. This is precious, truly precious. But I am afraid your friendship does not change anything, little Deathworlder. So step aside before I decide to show you what I do to things that get in my way." Kira did not move. "No," she said. The laughter stopped. Throck's eyes narrowed, and his scales seemed to darken as blood rushed to the surface. A sign of aggression in Voruan that Kira had read about in her research. "No?" he repeated, as if he had never heard the word before. "You will never touch her again," Kira said, her voice clear and steady, loud enough for every watching student to hear. "Not tomorrow, not ever, and if you try, I will stop you." For several seconds, no one moved. Then Throck's face split into a grin that showed rows of serrated teeth. "This is wonderful," he said, turning to his pack. "The human thinks she can fight, did you hear that? The soft little Deathworlder wants to challenge a Voruan." He looked back at Kira, and there was genuine delight in his eyes. "Very well, little human. Let me show you what happens when prey forgets its place." He lunged forward, one massive arm reaching out to shove her aside. Moving with the casual speed of a predator who had never met anything it could not overwhelm with simple strength. He was fast. Kira was faster. She did not back away, did not try to create distance, and instead she stepped into his reach, inside the arc of his arm, close enough to smell the musk of his scales. Her hand came up and caught his wrist, redirecting his momentum, and her other hand drove into the joint of his elbow with all the force her body could generate. The sound was horrible, a wet crack that echoed through the corridor, and Throck screamed. His arm bent the wrong way, the armored scales splitting as the bone broke through, and he stumbled backward with a look of absolute shock on his face. His hunting partner moved next, faster than the others, his jaws opening wide as he lunged for Kira's throat. She dropped low, letting his bite pass over her head, and her fist drove upward into the soft tissue beneath his jaw, hitting the nerve cluster she had studied, and he went rigid for a moment before she grabbed his head and twisted, dislocating his jaw with a sound like cracking wood. 2 down in 3 seconds. The third member of the pack rushed her from the side, his claws raking toward her face, and one of them caught her forearm, tearing through skin and muscle and sending blood spraying across the floor. Kira did not stop. She turned into the attack, accepting the wound, getting inside his guard, and her elbow slammed into the cluster of nerves at the base of his skull that she had memorized from the anatomy charts. He dropped like a puppet with cut strings. The fourth member of the pack was already running, his clawed feet pounding against the floor as he fled down the corridor. And Kira let him go. She turned back to Throck, who was on his knees now, cradling his broken arm and making sounds that might have been sobbing. "You," he gasped. "You cannot do this. Do you know who my father is?" "Do you know what?" Kira stepped forward and grabbed him by the front of his uniform, hauling him up until his face was level with hers, and her eyes were cold and hard and utterly without mercy. "I know exactly who your father is," she said, "and I want you to give him a message for me." She leaned close, her voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear. "Tell him that Velathani is under my protection now. Tell him that if anyone touches her again, I will come for them. And tell him that humans do not make threats we are not prepared to keep." She released him, and he collapsed to the floor. Kira stood over him, blood dripping from her wounded arm, her chest heaving with exertion. And she raised her voice so that every witness in the corridor could hear. "She is under my protection," she announced. "Spread the word." Then she turned and walked back to Val, who was standing frozen with her hands pressed over her mouth and her eyes wider than Kira had ever seen them. "Kira," Val whispered. "Your arm. It's fine," Kira said, though blood was still running freely down her fingers. "It looks worse than it is. Humans heal too, you know? Just not as fast as you." She took Vel's hand with her uninjured arm and began walking toward the medical bay. Leaving Throck and his broken pack behind them, the corridor remained silent. Other students watched them pass with expressions of shock and awe and something that might have been respect. And no one tried to stop them. No one said a word behind them. Throck continued to whimper on the floor, the sound following them like music. "You beat them," Val said, her voice still barely above a whisper. "You actually beat them. I told you I would," Kira said. "But how?" Val asked. "They were bigger than you, stronger than you. Everyone knows Varun are superior fighters," Kira smiled. "And this time, there was warmth in it, where I come from," she said. "We learned a long time ago that size and strength are not everything. Sometimes what matters most is being willing to hurt someone who's hurting someone you love, and being good enough at it to make sure they remember." Vel's wings fluttered, a silvery expression of profound emotion, and she squeezed Kira's hand tightly. "You called me your friend," she said. "You are my friend," Kira confirmed. "No one has ever." Val stopped, unable to finish the sentence, and her bioluminescence flickered through colors that Kira did not have names for. They walked the rest of the way to the medical bay in silence, and behind them the whispers began to spread, carrying the story of what had happened to every corner of the station. The Deathworlder had fought for the broken. Silver's Deathworlder had won. The political storm that followed was unlike anything the station had seen in decades. Throck's father arrived within hours of receiving word of his son's injuries. A towering Varuan diplomat with medals on his chest and fury in his eyes, demanding that Kira be arrested and expelled and extradited to face justice under Varuan law. He spoke of assault, of unprovoked violence, of a savage Deathworlder attacking innocent students. And he threatened to withdraw the Varuan collective from 3 separate trade agreements if his demands were not met immediately. The Academy administration convened an emergency hearing, and for a few tense hours, it seemed like Kira would be sacrificed to preserve diplomatic relations. Then the human embassy got involved. The ambassador was a small woman with gray hair and kind eyes who did not look particularly threatening. But she walked into the hearing chamber with a data chip in her hand and a smile on her face that made several administrators go pale. "Before we proceed," she said, her voice pleasant and mild, "I would like to submit some evidence that I believe is relevant to this matter." She played the recordings. Kira had been thorough, spending weeks gathering footage from security cameras and personal devices, documenting every attack, every injury, every moment of Vel's torment at the hands of Throck and his pack. The chamber watched in silence as 8 months of systematic abuse played out on the screens. And by the end of it, Throck's father had stopped speaking entirely. My government has already shared this footage with the Galactic Press Network. The ambassador continued. The story should be breaking across major news channels within the hour. I thought you should know before you made any decisions you might regret. The hearing ended shortly after that. Throck and his pack were expelled from the academy within the day. Their diplomatic immunity revoked by their own government in a desperate attempt at damage control. And Throck's father was quietly recalled to the Varuan homeworld to explain how he had allowed his son to create such a catastrophic diplomatic incident. The administrators who had ignored Vel's complaints suddenly found themselves under investigation, and 3 of them resigned before the week was over. But for Kira, the most important change was in Vel herself. The Silphery girl sat in the medical bay while her wings healed. And for the first time since Kira had known her, she was not hunched over and hiding, not pressing herself against walls and flinching at shadows. She sat up straight, and her glow was returning. Soft pulses of color that grew stronger with each passing day. The Galactic Press wanted to interview her, and at first Vel refused, the thought of speaking to so many strangers making her want to disappear again. But Kira sat with her, and they talked about it for a long time. And in the end, Vel decided that she wanted to tell her story, not for herself, but for every other victim who had been told that their suffering did not matter. The interview was broadcast across 17 sectors. Vel spoke softly but clearly, describing what had been done to her and why no one had helped. And she spoke about the human girl who had appeared out of nowhere and refused to look away. I asked her once why she did it. Vel said, her wings fully spread behind her, iridescent and beautiful in the studio lights. She had nothing to gain. We were not the same species. She did not owe me anything, but she chose to fight for me anyway. The interviewer leaned forward, clearly moved by the story. What did she say? They asked. Vel smiled, and her glow brightened until she seemed almost luminous. She said that where she comes from, you do not need a reason to protect someone. You just need to see someone who needs protecting. The interview was shared millions of times. Something about the story resonated across species and cultures. The image of a small human girl standing against 4 Vorun warriors to defend a friend she had only known for weeks. And people began to talk about humans in a different way, not just as Deathworlders, not just as savages from a poison planet, but as something else, something that the galaxy had not quite understood until now, protectors months later. When the Academy had returned to something like normalcy, and Vel had begun to smile more often than she cried, the 2 of them sat together in their usual spot in the atmospheric gardens. Vel's wings were fully healed now, more beautiful than ever, and she let them spread wide to catch the artificial sunlight. No longer afraid of who might see, I have been thinking, Vel said, about what makes humans different from other species. Kira looked at her with raised eyebrows. And what did you conclude? You are not the strongest species, Vel said, or the fastest, or the smartest. There are species that surpass you in almost every measurable way. Thanks, Kira said dryly. Vel laughed. That wind chime sound that Kira had grown to love. But you have something that I have not seen in any other species. Vel continued. When you decide that someone belongs to you, when you claim them as yours, you will fight for them with everything you have. Even when it is hopeless, even when it costs you, even when there is no logical reason to do so. She turned to look at Kira, and her eyes were bright with emotion. You claimed me, she said. You saw a broken girl from a dying species, someone with no power and no value and no hope. And you decided that I was yours to protect, and you never wavered. Not once. Kira felt her throat tighten. You had value, she said. You always had value. You just could not see it. Vel reached out and took Kira's hand, her cool fingers intertwining with the human's warm ones. I can see it now, she said. Because of you, They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the light filter through the leaves of 100 different worlds. And Kira thought about her father and her mother and everyone who had ever taught her what it meant to be human. They had given her many things: strength, resilience, stubbornness, the refusal to quit, even when quitting made sense. But the most important gift they had given her was simpler than all of that. They had taught her to care. "Kira?" Vel said after a while. What happens now?" Kira considered the question, looking out at the garden and the station beyond it and the vast galaxy that stretched out in all directions, full of wonder and danger and countless beings who had their own stories to tell. "I do not know," she admitted. "But I know one thing for certain." "What is that?" Kira squeezed Vel's hand and smiled. "Whatever happens, you will not face it alone. Not anymore. Not ever again." Vel's wings fluttered, and she leaned her head against Kira's shoulder. And for the first time in years, she was not afraid of tomorrow across the galaxy. The story spread, passed from species to species, translated into 1,000 languages, becoming something larger than the two girls who had lived it. It became a warning and a promise, a warning to those who would prey upon the weak, that somewhere out there was a species who would not look away, who would not accept that cruelty was simply how things were, who would fight and bleed and die to protect those they called their own, and a promise to those who had no one to fight for them that the humans were out there, and the humans protected, and maybe, just maybe, one of them might find you and claim you as theirs, and then everything would change. That was the lesson the galaxy learned about humanity. Not their strength, not their endurance, not their stubborn refusal to die, but their love, fierce and irrational and unconditional. The kind of love that broke faces and shattered empires and moved stars. The kind of love that said, "You are mine, and I will keep you safe, no matter what it costs me." The kind of love that made humanity the most terrifying species in the galaxy and the most wonderful.